cuddly and riddled with chlamydia. That's not how you might expect to describe koalas, but it is the reality. As many as 80% of some wild koala populations have chlamydia, and it causes half of their deaths. And that's not the only risk they're facing. Their habitats, which are eucalyptus forests in Australia, are being devastated by wildfires, droughts, and urban development. So today we're breaking down the koala crisis, and you're going to hear how a new vaccine and conservation efforts could help turn things around for them. It's Hannah here. Welcome to What in the World, your podcast for the stories that everyone's talking about from the BBC World Service. And I'm speaking to Tiffany Turnbull, a BBC reporter who's in Sydney. Hey, Tiffany.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Now, I remember I went to Australia Zoo once and I got to hold a koala, and I was fascinated by how much they sleep. It basically slept the whole time. They said they sleep at about 20 hours a day. Have you spent a lot of time with koalas?
Yeah, they do basically nap for a living. I grew up in Queensland, southeast Queensland, which is one of the places that koalas are quite populous, or they used to be anyway. So I have childhood memories of spotting one in the tree in the backyard all the time, even rescuing a couple if they get separated from their parents and that kind of thing. We'd take them up to Australia Zoo, they'd get a checkup, and then Australia Zoo would find their mum and bring them back. But yeah, definitely growing up, they were everywhere.
And that is sadly changing. I mean, they're treasured in Australia and to Indigenous populations as well, but they are facing these increasing threats. How big of a problem is it for the size of their population?
It's a huge problem. They're, as you kind of touched on, they're Australia's kind of national icon, its most famous animal. But in recent years, populations just have been plummeting right across the eastern coast, which is where most Australians live. And in some places, they've even dropped by estimated 80%. And there are fears that koalas could be extinct within a generation now in some states.
One of the things that people are really surprised about when we talk about koalas is the fact that so many of them get chlamydia. And of course, here, it's known as an STI, a sexually transmitted infection or disease among humans. How widespread is it among koalas? And is it also sexually transmitted? Is it kind of the same as the chlamydia that we know among humans?
Yeah, so it's believed that koalas actually caught it from livestock. So chlamydia is not that uncommon in animals, but what is kind of unique to the koala is the rapid spread of the disease and the incredibly intense way that it affects koalas. But it is spread largely through kind of the same ways as in humans and other animals. So that is through like mating, or even some koalas spread it to their young by feeding them.
What kind of symptoms does it cause for the koalas?
So there are kind of two main ways that it manifests. The first is a kind of disease or infection of the eye. So it looks like conjunctivitis. The koalas that I've seen that are sick, their eyes are kind of almost glued shut with mucus. They can barely see. And the other form of chlamydia is that it tends to affect them with a infection of their reproductive organs, which is also quite problematic. That can be so painful and get so out of control that they die from that too. But even if they don't die, it really frequently makes them sterile, which means that they can't breed, which is obviously a huge problem for an endangered population where you really need them to be successfully breeding.
So it can make them blind and infertile. And I read that it can be treated with antibiotics, right?
Yes, it can be treated with antibiotics, but vets say even that is kind of a nightmare because the antibiotics attack bacteria in the koala's gut and kills that off. And that's a huge problem because koalas, famously, their primary food source is eucalyptus leaves, which is actually toxic. And so they have this really unique bacteria or enzymes or whatever in their gut that help them break down that kind of food. But the antibiotics mean that they can't really do that anymore again. So you have a starvation problem kind of from a different angle though. So the treatment can often kill them as well.
Their eating habits are so strange, aren't they? Because they're really fussy eaters. They only eat this specific type of eucalyptus and it knackers them because it's so indigestible, which is why they have to sleep for 20 hours. And now scientists have been carrying out clinical research about the chlamydia issue for the population, and they have developed a vaccine. And I think you've been speaking to some of the scientists behind that.
Yeah, I have. So they've been kind of working at this for 20 years now. So it's been a really long journey. There's the development of a vaccine, then you've got to test it. And if it doesn't quite work the way that you think it will, you've got to tweak it and then test it again. And you've got to go through kind of like vaccine development in humans too. You've got to go through all these regulatory hurdles to make sure that you're not just out there jabbing random koalas with vaccines that have no evidence behind them. So it's been a very long road for them. And there's kind of been two large groups that, or two main groups that have been advancing a vaccine slightly different. One required 2 doses, and so that's a challenge too, because you have to figure out how to get the koala its second dose. And as one of the vets joked to me, you can't just tell them their appointment's next Monday and expect them to show up.
They'll probably be sleeping. They'll sleep right through it.
Exactly. We've all been there. But the second one is the single-shot vaccines. That's obviously easier to administer, but there were some concerns about whether that would provide the level of protection that they needed to actually, fundamentally change the way that their bodies respond to the disease.
And once you administer the vaccine to the koalas, how effective is it at preventing them from getting chlamydia?
Yeah, so the research trials found that this was really, really effective. So I went to Currumbin Wildlife Hospital on the Gold Coast in Queensland and had a chat to the staff there. They were using the QT vaccine, and they were targeting a really, really diseased population nearby, where it's estimated about 80% of koalas in that population have chlamydia. And they vaccinated, or in the process of vaccinating, I think about 30 koalas, and so far only 3 of them have actually caught chlamydia, and all of them have recovered and been fine. So that's a great indicator that this is working. But then separately, the University of the Sunshine Coast has also wrapped like a decade's worth of clinical trials together and had a look at the results. And incredibly, they found that deaths among vaccinated koalas dropped by 2/3, which is extraordinary. But also exciting was the fact that the koalas that did catch chlamydia were catching it later, which is a big deal if, again, you're trying to get them to breed and expand their population. And so they saw things like populations that were headed right off a cliff towards extinction. There were a couple populations where it just completely turned things around. And I remember one of the researchers telling me quite excitedly about one population where now they're worried about overpopulation, and they're thinking about relocating some of those koalas just so they don't run out of habitat in the area.
That is really, really positive. How long do you think until the vaccine is rolled out more widely?
That's going to be a challenge too, unfortunately. So Australia is massive. As I mentioned, koalas are hard to find and hard to vaccinate. Researchers have struggled to a degree with funding in the vaccine development process. The vaccine rollout is probably going to be the same thing. And then they've got to think about, they can't vaccinate every koala. We don't know where they are. We don't know how many there are. And also that would just be like such an insurmountable task. So they've really got to think about which populations would benefit the most from the vaccine and target those. And so that's kind of the next step for them, is figuring out, okay, this is how much money we have. This is how much vaccine we have. These are the koalas that we think we should prioritize. Let's go and get them sorted.
So there's lots of different hurdles here, and also that fine line between letting the population thrive and bring itself back from being endangered and even, at risk of extinction, but without getting too big a population, without overpopulation. And aside from chlamydia, I want to talk a little bit about some of the other threats that koalas are facing, because they live in eucalyptus forests, and we've all seen some of the pictures and the videos of the wildfires and the devastation that has been happening in different parts of Australia in recent years.
Yeah, and that's one thing that all the researchers and all the vets and wildlife carers that I spoke to mentioned over and over and over, is that this vaccine is not enough to save the koala. There are much much bigger problems that we'll need to solve as well. So this buys us a bit of time to address some of those bigger issues, which include things like urbanisation. So if the koala doesn't have a tree, a vaccine's no use to it, really. So urbanisation is a huge problem here, because that means that they lose the habitat that they live in, but also that food source that we mentioned that is already quite rare. And urbanisation also leads them to encounter things like feral pets and cars and that kind of thing.
And the government is trying to tackle all of this in terms of the habitat and habitat loss. It recently talked about plans for the Great Koala National Park. Tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so this was an election promise of the state government of New South Wales about 2 years ago. This will put extra protections in place to make sure that habitat in this area is protected for koalas. And as I mentioned before, this is kind of like one of the main areas where those bushfires ripped through and decimated really, really important koala habitat. So creating this national park allows them to preserve what's left of that habitat, but also regrow some of that really critical eucalyptus forest.
And Tiffany, we actually heard from some of the people involved in making the Koala National Park happen. Here is Paula Flack from the National Parks Association of New South Wales.
When I first heard that the Great Koala National Park announcement was about to be made, I was actually sitting in a campaign meeting, and my colleagues and I were a little bit sceptical, because for 8.5 months following the completion of all of the assessment and community consultation and planning, the government had been telling us the announcement would be soon, and we were just getting so frustrated with the delays. But the Minister's office confirmed that indeed the Great Koala National Park was going to be announced the following day, and what's more, they were going to announce the full 176,000 hectares that we've been campaigning for, and there would be an immediate stop to the logging. So once we knew that, we were absolutely euphoric. The meeting was abandoned. We were all up and cheering and crying and hugging, and it was such a relief. I would like to see beyond this is that the New South Wales government will decide to actually pull out of logging of public native forests throughout the whole state, which would be the right thing to do. Western Australia's done it, Victoria's done it, and we know that the timber coming from these forests only contributes about 6% to our timber requirements. The rest is already coming from plantation. So we think these forests are much better standing for all the values they have for future generations. But in the meantime, we'll take what we've got, the Great Koala National Park. What a wonderful outcome. We are incredibly excited about this.
And this is Darcy Caruthers from the Australian Conservation Foundation.
The declaration of the Great Koala National Park in New South Wales is massive news, really positive news, and also desperately needed. And I say that because koalas are actually on a pathway to becoming extinct in the state of New South Wales by 2050. That's only 25 years away. And the continuous populations of koalas throughout Queensland, New South Wales, and the Australian Capital Territory are endangered. And a big part of why the species is struggling so much is because of the sheer amount of their habitat that's been destroyed. This has been a fantastic announcement out of New South Wales, and we really hope to see this followed up by ambitious action at the federal level with new laws that will actually protect nature introduced into Parliament by the end of the year.
Back to you, Tiffany. We've talked a little bit about the vaccine, and we've talked about the parks, all of these different ways that the koala population is going to be protected in Australia. It sounds like it costs a lot. Has there been pushback from people? What's been the reaction to all of these plans and this investment?
I think because koalas are such a beloved animal in Australia, there are very few people who would very publicly be like, no, don't spend that money on them. Don't save the very cute cuddly thing. But there has at times been pushback from farming groups or people who use native forest for business about the plans to protect some of these areas. But I would say protecting koalas is very popular with the broader population, and it's something that a lot of Australians are concerned about.
Tiffany, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
That's it from us. Thank you for joining us. If you like this episode, please do like, share, follow, subscribe. You can find us right here on YouTube 5 days a week. 2 of those episodes are here in the studio, so you can see us chatting away with some of your favourite guests. I'm Hannah. This is What in the World from the BBC World Service. We'll see you next time.